In the end, Serena's story isn't just about one woman standing tall against hate. It's about what happens when courage refuses to bow and unity breaks the silence of prejudice. Her strength lit a fire in her community, and that same fire can live in all of us. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it, let someone else hear these words, because every voice against hate makes us stronger, and every story of courage inspires the next one. Hit that like button, subscribe for more powerful stories. The evening sun dipped low across the quiet neighborhood, painting the sidewalks gold. It should have been peaceful, but instead, a storm was brewing. She stood there, strong, calm, with a quiet pride only those who've seen war carry. A black woman, a veteran, wearing her worn camo jacket like a second skin. For her, it wasn't fashion. It was history, sacrifice, survival. But to him, it was something else. A threat, a challenge, an excuse. A man, pale and tight-jawed, stepped out from his porch. His voice cut across the street like broken glass. "You don't belong here. Take that uniform off. This is a respectable neighborhood." Every word dripped with venom. Every syllable was meant to shrink her, to erase her service, to tell her she wasn't enough because of who she was and what she wore. But she didn't flinch. Not once. She locked eyes with him, steady as a battlefield stare, the kind that says, "I've faced worse than you. You won't break me." Still, the insults came, louder, crueler. He wanted a scene, he wanted control, he wanted her gone. And neighbors began to peek from their windows. The silence of the street filling with tension so sharp you could taste it. But what this man didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that her story didn't end at his command. Because behind her strength was an unshakable bond. A family forged not by blood, but by battles survived. She wasn't alone. Not now. Not ever. And as he sneered his final insult, something stirred on the horizon. Cars slowed. Boots hit the pavement. Shadows grew longer. One by one, figures began to appear. Men and women, disciplined, silent, moving with the unmistakable weight of experience. Her unit. Her brothers and sisters in arms. They hadn't come for a fight. They came for something more powerful. Respect. Recognition. A reminder that the uniform he despised was the very thing that gave him the freedom to stand there and insult. The man's smirk began to falter. The crowd of neighbors leaned in closer, and she just stood there, unshaken, as the world around her shifted, because this wasn't just about one man's cruelty. This was about every voice that ever told her she didn't belong. Every door slammed in her face. Every time her service, her sacrifice, her very existence was doubted. And tonight, she wasn't going to answer with anger. She was going to answer with truth, with dignity, with power. The question is, how do you silence a bully who thinks he owns the world? Sometimes, you don't have to say a word. The day had started like any other. The neighborhood was quiet, neat rows of houses standing shoulder to shoulder like soldiers on parade. Yards were trimmed, driveways swept clean, American flags fluttering lightly in the breeze. It was the kind of place meant to look picture perfect, as if no shadows could ever creep across its streets. For most people here, life was simple, routine, safe. But for Serena Daniels, it had always felt different. Serena was a veteran, a mother, a woman who had given years of her life to serve a country that often forgot to serve her back. She had worn the uniform not for glory, not for medals, but because she believed in something greater than herself, duty, sacrifice, and the promise of freedom. Now back home, she lived quietly in a modest house with her teenage son. She liked mornings on the porch with coffee steaming in her hands, afternoons tending to her small garden, evenings spent listening to her son's laughter bounce off the walls. To anyone passing by, she was just another resident. But to those who knew her story, she was something more. She had endured things most people could never imagine. The deafening roar of helicopters slicing through midnight skies. The smell of dust, smoke, and iron mingling in the heat of combat. The crushing weight of responsibility when lives hung on her decisions. She had carried all of that home with her, not as a burden, but as proof she had survived. Her neighbors didn't see that, though. They saw the camouflage jacket she still wore, sometimes without thinking. They saw the discipline in her posture, the strength in her walk. Some admired it, others whispered. And then there was Richard Coleman. Richard was the kind of man who believed the world should bend to his comfort. Middle-aged, well-off, polished to the point of arrogance. His lawn was always immaculate, his shirt always pressed, his voice always laced with authority he hadn't earned. He was known in the neighborhood as the one who filed HOA complaints for trash bins left out too long, or lawns cut a shade too high. To Richard, Serena was a disruption. Not because she was loud, she wasn't. Not because she was reckless, she was disciplined to her core. But because she didn't fit the mold of what he thought this neighborhood should be. He didn't like the camo jacket she wore on morning walks. He didn't like the old military boots she sometimes left by the porch. And he certainly didn't like the way she carried herself, with pride that refused to bow. For weeks, his glances lingered too long. His comments when neighbors gathered grew sharper. "Some people think this is a barracks," he'd mutter. "We worked hard for this neighborhood. We don't need that kind of presence here." It was always that kind, Serena noticed. Of course she did. A veteran learns to read a room long before words are spoken. She felt the shift, the sidelong looks, the cool smiles, the sudden silences when she passed by. She knew what was coming, even if no one else dared to say it out loud. Still, she held her ground. She had fought for her place in far harsher landscapes than this. This was supposed to be home, safe, a place her son could grow without fear. But beneath the perfect lawns and painted fences, something ugly was stirring, and it wouldn't stay hidden for long. The first sign, it wasn't just words, came on a Thursday morning. Serena opened her mailbox and found a letter folded tight, its paper trembling in her hands before she even read it. "Violation notice," stamped in bold. Too many personal effects displayed on her porch. Translation, her boots, her flag. Her camo jacket draped over a chair. Her heart sank, not because of the fine they threatened, but because she knew exactly who had filed the complaint. Richard Coleman, the man with perfect hedges and poisonous words. She could have laughed it off. She'd faced far worse than a letter, but when she saw her son's face, curious, confused. "Mom, why do they care about your boots?" Her chest tightened. This wasn't just about her. It was about the message. You don't belong here. The days that followed grew heavier. Neighbors she once waved to now looked through her as if she were invisible. Conversations stopped when she approached. Invitations never arrived. And always, from across the street, Richard watched, smiling, sipping his coffee, like a king surveying a kingdom he thought he owned. Then came the confrontation. It was late afternoon. Serena was trimming her roses when Richard strode over, HOA rulebook clutched in his hand. His voice was sharp enough to cut the air. "You think this is a military base? You don't get special treatment because you wore a uniform. This is a neighborhood. Respect it or leave." His words were loud. Intentionally so. Curtains twitched as neighbors listened in. Serena stood still, pruning shears in hand, eyes steady. "I fought for this country," she said quietly. "And I'll live in it the same as anyone else," Richard sneered. "Not dressed like that. Not acting like that. We don't need your kind lowering our property values." The venom dripped. And for the first time, her son heard it. His face fell, innocence cracking under the weight of a truth Serena had tried to shield him from. That night, Serena sat in silence. Memories of battlefields collided with the quiet cruelty of home. She could face bullets, but this constant erosion, this daily reminder that even in peace war followed her, was different. Still, she held on. Until the humiliation went public. The HOA meeting, a crowded room, neighbors packed into folding chairs, whispers filling the air. Serena sat in the front, shoulders squared, her son beside her. Richard stood at the podium, papers in hand, voice booming. "This resident is a repeated violator, displaying military gear, disrupting the community's image. We need to vote on further action." Eyes turned toward her. Some pitied, some judged, some looked away entirely. Her son shifted uncomfortably, shrinking in his chair. Serena rose. Her voice shook at first, then steadied. "I didn't wear this uniform for recognition. I wore it for all of you. For your children. For this neighborhood you're so desperate to protect. If my jacket offends you, maybe the problem isn't the jacket, gasps rippled. Richard's face twisted, but before he could respond, the chair of the HOA cleared her throat. Let's move to vote. The result was crushing. Fines increased. Threats of legal action whispered. And worse, the unspoken verdict, rejection. Serena left the hall that night with her son clutching her hand. Behind her, Richard's voice echoed. Some people never learn where they don't belong. The words burrowed deep. But Serena's spirit did not break. Not yet. Days later, another letter arrived. Harsher this time. Demands to remove offensive material from her property. Final warning. That evening, Serena stood on her porch, staring at her folded flag, the one she had carried through war zones, the one that had draped over the coffins of brothers and sisters lost. They wanted it gone. Her chest burned. How dare they? Her hands trembled as she reached for the flagpole. But before she could lower it, headlights cut across the street. Richard again, watching, waiting, a predator savoring victory, and that's when Serena decided this battle wouldn't be fought alone. She made a call, just one, to a voice that hadn't heard from her in years. And when she hung up, her heart was steadier than it had been in weeks, because Richard Coleman had no idea what storm was about to arrive, and when it did, it wouldn't knock quietly. The night was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that presses on your chest, making every breath feel stolen. Serena sat on her porch, her son inside asleep, the folded flag resting across her lap. She thought about the meetings, the insults, the stares that lingered too long. She thought about Richard Coleman's words echoing again and again in her mind. You don't belong here. But she also thought about something else. The oath she had once taken, the brothers and sisters who had stood beside her, the sacrifices that had carved scars across her body and soul. This fight was no battlefield, but it carried the same weight. And tonight, she would not be alone. The sound came first, a low rumble in the distance, tires crunching gravel, engines cutting one by one, then the footsteps, synchronized, steady, unshaken. Serena rose slowly, her heart pounding, as figures emerged from the shadows of the streetlights. They came in twos, in threes, her old unit. The ones who had once carried rifles beside her in desert heat and storm-black nights. Now, they carried something else, presence, loyalty, a wall of unyielding strength. Her son, woken by the noise, peeked through the window. His eyes widened as he saw them gather in formation on the street, and then Richard appeared. Right on cue. He stepped from his porch, robe-tied, coffee mug in hand, his smirk already plastered across his face. What's this? He sneered, voice loud enough for the neighborhood. Calling in backup? Trying to intimidate me? But his voice faltered as the silence deepened. 20 veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes forward, bodies rigid with the quiet discipline of warriors who had seen too much to be shaken by a suburban tyrant. Serena stepped forward, the camo jacket hanging proudly on her shoulders, boots crunching against the pavement. She stopped in the center of the street, her unit behind her like a living wall. This, she said, voice steady, is family. The word echoed through the night. Neighbors began to emerge. Porch lights flicked on, curtains pulled back, doors creaked open. The street filled with eyes, watching, waiting. Richard's smirk hardened. You think this changes anything? You can bring your little army, but the rules are the rules. You're still out of place here. The unit didn't flinch. Their silence was louder than any shout. Serena stepped closer, her voice rising, not with rage but with conviction. Out of place? I bled for this country. I carried its flag across fields of fire. I watched brothers die with its anthem on their lips. And you stand here in your robe, sipping coffee, daring to tell me I don't belong? Her words struck like thunder. Murmurs rippled through the crowd of neighbors. Some shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded. Some, for the first time, truly saw her. Richard's face twisted, his mask of control cracking. You don't scare me. None of you do. But his voice wavered. Serena's eyes locked on his. I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to remind you that your hatred can't erase sacrifice, that your prejudice can't erase service, and that your voice. She stepped closer still, the weight of her unit pressing behind her, will never be louder than ours. The silence that followed was deafening. And then, something broke. Not in Serena, but in the street itself. A neighbor across the road began to clap. Just once, then again. Another followed. And another, until the quiet neighborhood, once ruled by whispers, filled with applause. Richard froze, his face draining of color as the sound grew. The very people he thought he controlled were now standing against him. Serena didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply turned, placed her hand over her heart, and looked to her unit. Together, they saluted. Her son stepped out onto the porch, chest puffed, pride shining in his eyes. For the first time, he didn't see his mother as the victim of insults. He saw her as she truly was, a warrior, a leader, a woman who refused to bow. Richard stumbled backward, muttering under his breath, his power shattered not by violence, but by unity. The night ended not with fists, not with screams, but with a truth carved so deep it could never be erased. Serena Daniels belonged, and nothing, not hate, not prejudice, not one man's fragile pride, would ever change that. But the story wasn't finished. Because what began as one confrontation was about to ripple far beyond one street, one neighborhood, and the world was about to listen. The street was never the same after that night. For days, whispers spread like wildfire. The story of Serena Daniels, the black veteran who stood tall against humiliation, who called on her unit not to fight but to stand in solidarity, traveled beyond the fences of her neighborhood. What was once hidden in hushed complaints and folded violation letters was now spoken openly. The truth about Richard Coleman, and the truth about Serena. Neighbors who had once looked away began to stop by her porch. Some came with apologies, stumbling over words they should have spoken long ago. Others brought small gifts, pies, flowers, even handshakes that lingered longer than expected, as if to silently say, "We see you now. We should have seen you before." But Serena wasn't interested in pity. What mattered was her son. She watched him walk to school with his head higher, watched him speak about his mother's courage when friends asked. For the first time, he didn't carry the shame of whispered insults. He carried pride, and that was worth more than any apology. Richard, on the other hand, found his empire of control crumbling. Complaints once taken seriously were now met with skepticism. At the next HOA meeting, the same neighbors who had clapped in the street challenged him, questioning his motives, his prejudice, his right to dictate who did or didn't belong. His power drained not with a bang, but with a slow, inevitable fade. Eventually, Richard moved away. His house, once immaculate, stood empty for months, as if the neighborhood itself was cleansing the stain of his presence. But Serena stayed, not just in her home, but in the hearts of the people around her. The very same neighbors who once turned away now asked her advice, listened to her stories, leaned on her strength. And Serena, though scarred by the ordeal, found herself becoming something unexpected, a leader once more. Her unit's visit had been meant as a show of solidarity, but it became something larger. Photos taken by neighbors circulated online. Images of veterans standing shoulder to shoulder under the glow of streetlights, a woman in camo leading them, a neighborhood awakening in applause. Those images spread, shared thousands of times, igniting conversations about race, respect, and the quiet battles fought on home soil. Local journalists reached out. Community leaders wanted her to speak. For the first time, her story wasn't dismissed. It was heard. And when Serena stood before audiences, schools, and town halls, she didn't speak with bitterness. She spoke with truth. Racism isn't just ugly words shouted in the street, she told them. It's the slow erosion of dignity, the constant reminder that you're unwanted. It weakens communities, not because of the one who spews it, but because of the many who stay silent. But silence can be broken. And when it is, healing begins. Her words struck chords because they weren't abstract. They were lived. They were real. And they came from someone who had faced both enemies overseas and enemies at her doorstep. Her son watched her from the front row, pride shining in his eyes. He no longer just saw his mother as the woman who cooked his dinners and paid the bills. He saw her as a force, A living lesson that courage wasn't about bullets or medals. It was about standing tall when the world tried to push you down, and the neighborhood itself changed. Slowly, yes, but tangibly. Where once Richard had enforced silence through fear, Serena's story inspired conversations through courage. Neighbors who had never spoken to one another began to connect. Barbecues were shared, fences became friendlier, and children who once played separately began to mix without question. The poison of prejudice lost its grip, but Serena never forgot the cost. She knew that Richard wasn't unique, that there were thousands more like him, hidden behind perfect lawns and polite smiles. But she also knew something more powerful, that unity could break their hold. That prejudice, when exposed, withers under the weight of truth. In the quiet of her home, she often sat with her flag unfolded, spread across the table. Not as a relic of battles past, but as a reminder of battles still being fought. And each time her hand brushed across the fabric, she whispered the same words to herself. I belong. And so does my son, and so will every child who comes after us. That was her victory, not in breaking Richard, but in building something stronger, a community that had learned the cost of silence and the power of standing together. Because at its core, this wasn't just Serena's story. It was a story about us, about the neighborhoods we build, the voices we amplify, the silence we allow, and the courage it takes to break it. And if there is one lesson that rings louder than all the rest, it is this. Racism destroys families. Prejudice weakens communities, but unity brings healing. And courage, true courage, defeats hate. The applause on that night still echoes, not just in one street, but in every place where someone dares to stand against injustice. And maybe, just maybe, the next time a voice says you don't belong, another voice will rise. Stronger, louder, unshaken, yes I do, and I always will.